Good day, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us on today's Referentenbesprechung, where I will deal once again with a topic related to the pandemic, and namely how vaccination rates are dividing the world in terms of international travel. I will now proceed to share my screen. And so let us begin by considering today that we will start witnessing a haphazard series of travel restrictions of varying degrees. Some of countries will resort to full entry prohibition unless vaccination is proven, whereas others might make it conditional on whether somebody shows a certificate of vaccination or remains in quarantine and shows a negative test as an alternative. But it is a big web of different measures and far from harmonized, as we will see today. And at the core is a legal instrument known as the International Health Regulations of the World Health Organization, which I have presented here before. So persons lucky enough to have already received doses or both doses of the vaccine correspondingly may have noticed they received these certificates, or they may then request or download an electronic certificate that demonstrates that they have been vaccinated. And there's already also an indication of which vaccines they received. These documents will then be used internationally to ascertain that the person has been vaccinated in a manner that authorities in other countries can also verify this information. So this is aimed at preventing that there are fake documents in which a person claims to have been vaccinated but hasn't actually. And in any case, this will lead to a differential treatment in international travel. As we have seen already here in the European Union, there is a certificate being issued that is valid throughout the entire EU and will be, again, verified by authorities at the point of entry to a country. And today I will look at the international law aspects of these restrictions to international travel, or these conditionalities, so to say, to international travel. And I will look first at how this is related to the international health regulations. I will also address how this takes place in a lopsided vaccine distribution worldwide. As we have all seen, the distribution has been highly unequal, and this leads to a very asymmetrical picture of vaccination rates. And lastly, I will make some arguments on how we could think of ways in the future to prevent these after effects of the lopsided distribution, because this is ultimately the result of a distribution that was designed and chosen last year in 2020, and we now see the effects of this asymmetrical distribution, which will derive in a higher impact and higher restrictions for those lower income countries that for some reason have not been able to secure sufficient doses of the vaccine. And so at the core, as I mentioned, is the International Health Regulations of 2005 with 196 states parties. And this instrument, which is the core international law normative in the field of cross-border spread of disease, has one as its objective and scope, and which will form the basis of today's analysis, is to prevent, protect against, control, and provide a response to the international spread of disease, which avoids unnecessary interference with international traffic and trade. And this is the key word or the key sentence, because the purpose is indeed to protect international commerce in its many forms, trading goods and services, from unnecessary disruptions due to infectious diseases. So in the past, when there was little knowledge about the nature of these diseases and how to prevent them, states would often resort to very disruptive measures and very haphazard measures against international travel and trade under the argument that there was a threat to health coming from other countries, so they needed to diminish transit from between countries as much as possible in order to prevent the entry of these diseases. And the liberalization of international trade is now regulated by the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the law of the World Trade Organization with 164 states parties. But there is no equivalent for international travel. So in terms of the movement of goods, we have a trend towards liberalization and a legally enshrined path towards the liberalization of the movement of goods across borders. But for international travel, there is no equivalent. One regional exception is the Schengen Accords and the European space, but there is no global version of these accords. I mean, the Schengen Accords establish a burden for those states that want to restrict movement across borders. They need to justify it additionally, but at the general international level, there is no such legal agreement in place. So states have leeway in regulating international travel unless there are special agreements stating otherwise. Sometimes there may be bilateral agreements that establish indeed an additional burden in case a state wishes to restrict the movement of persons across borders. And this follows a general tenet of globalization, where the liberalization of the cross-border movement of goods is more widespread in comparison to the movement of persons. So states have much more interest in the movement of goods than in the movement of persons generally. And this is, of course, has been the source of criticisms on how we have framed globalization so far. And it is crucial to keep in mind that the international health regulations is not a legal instrument addressing migration as such, and migration framed as a person wishing to establish residence in another country. Because international travel, for the purposes of the HR at least, is strictly understood as one conducted for temporary reasons. So not to establish residence, but to conduct specific activities, business activities, leisure, such as tourism, and so on. Under international law, then, authorities retain their sovereign prerogatives to regulate health requirements for migrants. So those persons wishing to establish residence may be subjected to additional requirements than those foreseen by the international health regulations. So today we will focus on international travel as it is envisaged by the international health regulations. And here we see, for instance, what is applicable to vaccine passports. Not just to vaccines, so it can be also immunity, but to vaccines in particular under Article 31. States may require, among others, vaccination as a condition of entry for any travelers. And this authorizes them to use vaccination certificates as a reason to deny entry to persons. And furthermore, Article 31st in its second paragraph of the International Health Regulations do state that the entry may be denied when a person fails to either consent to vaccination or to show the proof of it. And so this gives states the sovereign right to deny entry, again, on health reasons. If there are other reasons at stake, the international health regulations are not applicable. But the goal of the international health regulations is to ensure that whenever health hazards are used as a reason to possibly deny entry, they do so according to the steps foreseen by these regulations. And moreover, Article 36 does state that if a traveler has a certificate of vaccination or other prophylaxis, they shall not be denied entry as a consequence of the disease to which the certificate refers, even if coming from an affected area, unless the competent authority has verifiable indications that the vaccination was not effective. So if For instance, one of the vaccines which has not been internationally recognized is used, other states can indeed deny entry, even though this person may show a certificate of vaccination issued by his or her own country, in case the other state does not recognize the vaccine. And this can lead to a puzzle when there are different vaccines at stake, because there may be indeed a, a difference in the time frame in which vaccines are authorized from one country to the other. And this can eventually lead to some confusion and to uh, some vaccines being valid in one country but not in others. And we do have the World Health Organization, who can issue what's known as they can issue their own certification, but again, they might take a bit longer than other countries to do so. Um, and these vaccination certificates are certainly not new. They have a resurgence now due to COVID-19. They were first devised in 1959 by the WHO, but as several diseases stopped being a risk, as countries started gradually abandoning the requirement of these certificates for most of the infectious diseases that are foreseen by the international health regulations. But currently, several countries are adjusting international travel restrictions in divergent ways, as we saw in this initial map. This is far from harmonized, and it's not the goal of the international health regulations to strive towards a full harmonization. And indeed, full bans of entry on grounds of health are currently the exception rather than the rule. There are countries who refuse entry, such as Australia. Rather, multiple countries have chosen to request a combination of tests and quarantines from not vaccinated persons, as otherwise they may indeed deny entry. And if there is a vaccine at stake, the goal is to not require these measures from the persons that can show now a certificate of vaccination. And in past decades, countries have requested vaccination certificates as a condition of entry. So even quarantines and and tests were not enough. And this was particularly the case of yellow fever, which until recently was required in several countries. Vaccination against yellow fever was required in several countries as a condition of entry. Other diseases than yellow fever have less restrictive alternatives, but it was considered that yellow fever, indeed, due to its features, was a high risk and therefore could be invoked as a reason to deny entry. And recently, the WHO issued recommendations regarding COVID-19 vaccine certificates under the international health regulations, and namely, not to require proof of vaccination as the only pathway or condition permitting international travel, given limited global access and inequitable distribution. Ideally, and these are recommendations ultimately, but ideally, states should make a risk analysis and try to find alternatives such as testing or quarantine requirements. So not to refuse entry, because this will effectively condemn those countries with lower vaccination rates to not be able to travel, unlike those that have received sufficient vaccination doses and have advanced with their vaccination campaigns. So the goal of this recommendation is to somehow mitigate the impact of the distributive inequalities and in regarding the COVID-19 vaccines. Moreover, if states do choose to go further and require these vaccines as a condition of entry, Article 43 does allow in principle, but Article 43 does state as well that these measures that restrict international travel are not more restricted than reasonably available alternatives that would achieve the appropriate level of health protection. This is a complex article to interpret, and indeed it has been debated, okay, what would be appropriate, and what are the alternative, are there less restrictive alternatives, are they really available to a country, Or can they go further than what is the less restrictive alternative, as long as they notify and justify to the WHO why they are doing so? So it is not fully precluded, but of course, it is assumed that they will notify and justify, and that other states may challenge those measures. At least within the WHO, it is other avenues for challenge may not be immediately available. Instead, in the absence of COVID-19 vaccine certificates, states can resort to showing a negative PCR test or temporary quarantines, or both, as a requirement of entry. So this combination is being employed by certain countries as countries that do not forbid entry, depending on whether a person has a vaccination or not. And if they, if states do not take these alternatives, again, they should notify the WHO, and they need to justify why they resort to the more restrictive alternative. They need to provide a public health rationale. But we can see now in several European countries that vaccination certificates are not required, but those persons that are not able to demonstrate vaccination must show a negative PCR test and potentially undergo a quarantine for several days. So it is, even though we see these less restrictive alternatives, they are still an economic burden. Because if it's a short-term stay, you can imagine that, particularly if it's difficult to find a PCR test in a country, and then if it's not feasible for this person to undergo a 10-day quarantine because his or her activity was going to be shorter than this anyhow. So this person will then reconsider the purpose of the travel as a whole, and international travel will effectively be divided along vaccination rates. So those countries that have higher vaccination rates will have much more freedom in moving across borders than those that do not. Again, even though it's not for non-migration purposes, it nevertheless does prevent those other persons from those countries with lower vaccination rates to undertake economic activities in other countries. And so the gradual lifting of these restrictions to international travel will create higher burdens for lower income countries. This all, again, is a consequence of the original decision to distribute the vaccines in such an asymmetrical manner. We see here the map of global inequity in the distribution of vaccines. So those with a darker color have vaccinated more persons than those with a lighter color. So those that have not vaccinated as many people will be indeed subjected to an additional burden when they do attempt to travel elsewhere. And this, again, leads me to the conclusions of today, that this lopsided global distribution was actually never a foregone conclusion. It was rather an active decision by states with higher purchasing power who chose to hoard and to accumulate as many vaccine doses as they could for their own populations. And this often came at the expense of distributing the vaccines elsewhere. So what we see today in terms of international travel is but one reflection of this decision throughout 2020. And these restrictions on international travel, I want to emphasize, are maybe legal, but they are still an after effect of global distributive inequities regarding the vaccines against COVID-19. So it stands up for debate whether the enjoyment of economic, social, cultural lives globally should include taking into consideration these after effects of the lopsided distribution of life-saving medicine, not only for the immediate purposes of preventing infection and death rates, but also eventually for when we strive towards reopening the global economy, so that these measures punish those states that, due to their economic circumstances, were not able to secure as many doses as others. And this, again, is the after effect that we could try to figure out how to prevent in future similar events. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will be looking forward to the ensuing discussion.